We need to find ways to work in non-intuitive ways because we've endlessly tried, and I've endlessly tried the ways that make cultural sense. We need to heal in non-intuitive ways.
Thomas Zimmerman, welcome back to the Art and Science of EMDR. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Super
and thank you.
happy to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to say a big thank you, other than the kind of like generic thank you, for doing everything you're doing. I think that you're one of the most generous people that I know. Definitely the most generous person in the world of EMDR. And I think you're changing the world of EMDR in different ways. And yes, you're writing a book and you're teaching the 4 blinks, which I'm assuming most people know about. But I think that also the generosity, the giving that you have and you do, people see that and people recognize it and people appreciate it. So I want to say a big thank you for that.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, so I wanted to start this interview by asking you a personal question. You have a new book, and in the book, you are talking about your childhood in the 70s. And you're saying, and I'm quoting, children were not the irreplaceable things they have become. We were things that happened to you. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about that, the experience of that.
Yeah. So I grew up in a very, very specific context. And of course, in a lot of ways, I grew up with an enormous amount of privilege. I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and we were not starving and had some privilege. But when I grew up, I looked around the world and it seemed like the grown-ups were not okay. Even as a kid, it's just like, they don't know what they're doing. They just don't know what they're doing. And what I concluded very early on is that they're not going to be of much help to me. So I got to figure things out myself because they look like they'd been through something horrible. So, the context in which I grew up was one that kind of required a certain amount of self-erasure, right? Which would show up in, a lot of different ways and show up as dissociative stuff. But also, I think when you don't get your needs met when you're a kid and you have to figure things out on your own, and then those things kind of compound and then grow. And then as a teen, I discovered Catholic mysticism. And I'm like, oh, are you kidding me? There's a spirituality around self-erasure. I can do that. And boy, I did that. And it was absolutely wonderful. One of the most amazing experiences in the universe, right up until the point that it wasn't. And then as a 21-year-old man, I like fell into a body that I no longer had any kind of ability to like manage or control. So I guess a part of it is that a lot of what I have to talk about comes from having been a pretty pervasively traumatized human being who tried really creative ways to survive. And that does show up in the new book. The book is a book for therapists about how to do EMDR therapy, but I talk about myself some. I talk about, the complex issues related to grief because many of us are at the age where we have to take care of the people that didn't know how to take care of us. So I talk about the complications of that when my mom fell in my house while I was taking care of her and then passed away this year. So just complicated, intersections of trauma and grief. But I come from trauma. So
yeah, and I think that it's important to help. Yeah, I want our viewers to know that this is a book for EMDR therapists about how to do EMDR therapy, specifically with complex trauma. But you, Tom, the person who wrote the book, has this background. So you talk about your personal background, but you also talk about society. And I'm going to bring another quote from the book. And you're saying the same cultures that wound us construct obstacles to healing. So I guess two questions. How does our culture wound us? And what are these obstacles that constructs for healing, for us to
Yeah,
heal?
right. So trauma occurs in cultural context, right? So, and even in my own childhood, I just talked about families are cultures, neighborhoods are cultures, schools are cultures, community mental health centers are cultures, regions of the country are cultures. And I grew up in a peculiar one. South Louisiana is this very bizarre culture in the United States, right? And linguistic cultures, right? Racialized cultures and cultures of privilege and cultures of oppression. So every single thing that we experience is experienced in cultural context. If an asteroid destroys your garage today, every meaning and understanding that we have about that is heavily, heavily culturally constructed. So when I was a young adult trying to heal, there wasn't anybody around me who knew how people heal. But there's plenty of cultural guidance about how to heal. One of my family's main ways that you manage and heal from trauma is you stay dissociated from it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Louisiana is known for drinking and,
Hmm.
partying. And
Yeah,
so,
that's one way
and
to.
culture. So there's lots and lots of ways, so basically culture shape what counts as trauma. Cultures heavily shape how we're allowed to heal from it. They shape the landscape of possibility about how you can heal from things. Cultures shape which approaches to healing are normal and which are weird, right? And many of the cultures that wound us will want us to endlessly do the things that don't work, but that make sense, right?
Mhm.
So I suppose what I'm saying is that we need to find ways to work in a non-intuitive ways because we've endlessly tried, and I've endlessly tried the ways that make cultural sense. We need to heal in non-intuitive ways, find ways to heal in new ways and non-intuitive ways.
Yeah. So in the book, you also talk about the necessary conditions or the conditions that are necessary for healing. And I think you're bringing Bruce Ecker's work. Do you mind talking a little bit about that? I think that this is a concept that is relatively new to me. One of our community
Yeah.
members mentioned Bruce Ecker, second edition of his book
Mhm.
that I, of course, immediately got. And it makes so much sense. Makes sense and explains why EMDR works, but not only EMDR, right? Why other
Right.
therapies that work.
Yeah. Good. So, yeah, my kind of elevator talk understanding of this is that, and again, Bruce Ecker's work is also happening in a broader culture context too. So let's talk a tiny bit about Bruce Ecker and then pivot from there. So Bruce Ecker looked at what was transformational. When clients reported having a transformational experience in therapy, looked at it, found some core elements in it, and also tried to find evidence of that in the lab research, which has been happening really strongly since about the year 2000. And again, what Bruce Ecker says, and I'm going to talk about ways that Bruce Ecker's doing something different than what we're doing, but I want to talk about what in his work I draw from. What Bruce Ecker says is something that if humans had any kind of insight would have been the most obvious thing in the universe, which is that if you want to heal, you need to activate a piece of difficult something and then encourage the client to sit with an experience that is different or disconfirms the expectation and the bad memory. So in summaries, I could say it multiple ways. So humans heal when they have experiences that disconfirm the expectation and the bad memory. This is not too different than one of van der Kolk's most quoted lines, which is that in order to heal, we need to have experiences that deeply and viscerally contradict the helplessness, rage, collapse generated by the trauma. So what I've been suggesting is an echo of Bruce Ecker's. I've become convinced that that's the way we heal. I've become convinced that every time I've ever gotten past something, that's how I've done it. And I'm convinced this is what happens in EMDR therapy too. Yes, there's a lot in EMDR therapy that may be confirming of the expectation and the bad memory, but what we see in every transformational EMDR session is clients having an experience that is different than the expectation and the bad memory as the old stuck information connects to the right now adaptive information. Parts work, those people who do parts work, what parts work is from this conceptualization is parts of you having relational experiences with other parts of you that are different than the expectation and the learning in the difficult memories. Okay, so Flash is literally bring a tiny piece of the memory into working memory and then have 6 back-to-back experiences, which show you experientially that the bad memory is not happening right here, right now, that it is over. Even EMDR 2.0, if you watch what happens in demos of EMDR 2.0, what's happening is, yes, they're activating the client, but what's the client doing? They're laughing, they're chuckling, they're jumping left, they're jumping right. They're not having the experience that they're used to having. They're literally having a disconfirming experience of the expectation and the bad memory. So in all these, and again, somatic experiencing. What is somatic experiencing? Somatic experiencing is activating a particular difficult something and then encouraging the client to have an experience that is different than the expectation, the schema encoded into that bad memory or that bad experience. So my book is organized around that idea. And by the way, that idea is something, it's one of the ways we already understood as therapists that people heal. That core idea underlies a lot of other psychotherapies. But I think that's what our task needs to be, is to promote people having experiences and learning experientially in ways different than the expectation of the bad memory. And then really quickly, people will say, wait a minute, doesn't Bruce Ecker spend all this time constructing a precise disconfirmation? Whereas we're kind of just fiddling with general disconfirmations. Absolutely. Look at what Bruce Ecker's trying to move. He's trying to move a whole negative cognition about yourself. He's trying to move a whole quarter of Boston all at once. And if you're doing that, the key you need to do that has to be laser precise. We're trying to move one memory. The key that you need to get into the Bank of America vault in New York City is different than the key that we need to get into a moped. And we're moving mopeds. Bruce Ecker is moving whole economies of information in your mind. So he would kind of grumble about this. And if you've watched interviews with him, he has strong opinions about exactly how this has to happen. But I think the core idea that we heal when we have experiential learning that is different than the expectation of the bad memory is simply, I'm going to need to be convinced that it's not true.
Okay. And is relational healing, is the therapeutic relationship part of this
Absolutely.
confirmation?
Absolutely. And I suggest this, that I don't know how we heal relationally outside of relational experiences. Yeah, you can do it in parts work, but I don't think I've ever healed relationally outside of nurturing or corrective relational learning, right? It's really, really hard to do. Maybe people can do it in psychedelics, I'm not sure, but the therapeutic relationship really accounts for why EMDR often isn't transformational as a self-guided activity, right? It's not very good. I jokingly say that Shapiro was the last person who had a transformational experience with self-led EMDR in 1987. That's not true. Some people have pretty good, but in general, I think a lot of what's disconfirming about EMDR is I'm expecting to be judged. I'm expecting not to be able to handle this. And look, the therapist has my back. The therapist is looking at me warmly. I'm expecting not to be, I'm expecting this memory to be happening again, but this bilateral and this therapist and this context is helping me stay present with this difficult experience. And look at me right here, right now, handling this, disconfirming, disconfirming, disconfirming. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, but I'm wondering why. We know that it's true. We know that the relationship is a major part, and relational healing is a big component of why EMDR therapy works. And despite all that, most trainings focus on protocols and procedures and talk very little. Both trainings, trainers, authors, books, literature.
Mhm.
Why do you think it is in 2024, despite us knowing all that, it's not being talked about so much?
Yeah. I think there are many deficits in kind of the perspectives with which we bring EMDR education. And that's one of them. That's one of them. I'm also will suggest that because what we're really talking about, right? So the technique part is important. And right in Andrea's definition of EMDR, that EMDR's efficacy derives from the interaction among the client, the therapeutic, approach, and the, and the therapist. So Andrea's definition of EMDR says that what is magical here emerges out of the interaction of the people that are there and this technique. But it's not easy to teach, right? Those relational things are not easy to teach. And I do want to be kind to the idea that people go to trainings and it's 50 hours of training. That is a lot of training. And EMDR is not particularly easy to learn. So I think we can do better, and I think that's an important part of it. But teaching therapists how to leverage the therapeutic relationship in ways to build adaptive information is a difficult clinical and teaching task, right? It's not 8 phases, right?
Right.
It's
It's a
not
lot more.
it's not even a morning chunk of content, right? But I think
Yeah.
it's our work as therapists. And I think it would be nice to say, I think it would be nice to just nod to the fact that a lot of what is magical in EMDR happens around and underneath and between and mixed in with the protocol. Because I think a lot of people graduate, get through their EMDR training really thinking EMDR is this kind of magic spell that I say these words in this way. And that's not Shapiro's intention. And you know, that's not but that's the message people get, is that if I
Right.
do these things in this way, then this memory is going to somehow move in a positive direction. And that's wrong. And
Right.
it's going to leave people short
Right.
and they're going
Agreed.
to,
And I think Shapiro made it in the third edition even clearer than in
yeah,
previous editions that, this is more than just a protocol, it's a whole therapy. Tom, I want to talk about one of the metaphors they use in the book that I think it makes so much sense. I never heard it before, but I think that this is something concrete that people can take to help themselves conceptualize and help clients understand. So in terms of how big or small the trauma is and the adaptive networks, you're talking about the whale and the boat. Can you explain this metaphor?
yeah. So again, EMDR is not magic, right? What we're connecting in EMDR therapy is information to other information. And Shapiro's very, very clear. If you do not have enough adaptive information, you can't resolve a memory. If a memory needs it, so you have to have a landing place. You can't connect a lie to a lie. You can't connect old stuck information to nothing, right? So out of the AIP is this core idea that what's happening is that the old stuck information is connecting to adaptive information, which is already in you. It just hasn't been able to link up and facilitate that yet. But what I like about the kind of boat and the whale metaphor is you really have to have a landing place. You cannot land a whale into a boat the size of a canoe. You simply
Hmm.
can't do it. Relatively healthy people have been resourced well by life. They have adaptive information the size of a cruise ship. So they can land. That's why we want to stay out of their way. I talk a lot about modifications and adjustments and all of this. Healthy people, Shapiro's exactly right. Go after the big stuff first. Stay out of the way. Let things go where they go. They have a boat big enough to land every fish in their ocean, and they don't have whales. Do you know how I know they don't have whales? They have a cruise ship. If you have a
Hmm.
cruise ship, you don't have an ocean filled with monsters. That's the privilege of being a non-pervasively traumatized human, is that, and if you are a pervasively traumatized human, very, very likely, unless you've had a lot of experiential learning, different than the learning in the trauma, you probably have a canoe. And if you have a canoe, we need to be very careful what we let you hook or what we promote you hooking onto, because you have to have adaptive information and you have to have enough of it needed for that difficult experience to connect to and metabolize into. So
Excellent. To just continue with the same metaphor, so let's say I have a, or one of my clients has a canoe and not large enough boat and a pretty, big whale of trauma. How do you make this boat larger?
there are many ways of making a boat larger, and don't miss the fact that working on smaller traumas is one of them. Because what do we know? So again, in order to work somewhere, clients need to be prepared to do EMDR therapy, right? And again, the specific requirements of what's needed to do EMDR therapy, we can appreciate. You need to be able to slow down, be present, notice. The distress that comes needs to come within your window of tolerance, right? And you need a landing place for the difficult stuff that you're working on. So one strategy that I think we probably don't use enough is you can work on smaller targets. Resolving smaller targets instantly generates adaptive information. It also generates some distress tolerance. It also lets you get good at reeling in fish, because it's not just, so our leverage, our points of leverage are we can provide psychoeducation and experiential learning. And there are whole trainings we can do on helping people develop adaptive information through perspective taking exercises, through parts work, right? So a lot of the adaptive information that is needed that my clients don't have is related to developmental needs and whose job it is to meet them. So one of my resources that's been out there for years is my attachment figure resource, borrows heavily from Laurel Parnell's work. And it is an expedited way of doing parts work that specifically addresses the deficits that are most relevant in doing EMDR therapy. So through parts work, through perspective taking exercises, by working on smaller memories, by how I sit in the session, right? The way that I exist in the session. All of this are opportunities to create disconfirming / learning experiences. So I think what EMDR therapists need to do is create the opportunity for experiential learning inside and outside of EMDR therapy. Yeah.
Okay. You were talking about attachment wounds and just attachment ruptures in general, which is something that's really, really hard to work with the EMDR. Why is it so hard? And what would I know this is not something that we can, you can give a complete answer
Yeah.
in this format, but maybe some
Yeah.
kind of a clue to how people can start conceptualizing the work differently, and what are some of the tools that you would
Yeah.
recommend to work with attachment
Good.
wounds?
So let's compare it with events, right? Bad events have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they're terrible, right? But the way they're stored in our nervous system is as a discrete chunk of something. And I'm not saying that a single event can't completely upend your life. right? I'm not saying that at all. But those of us who've worked with a lot of childhood sexual trauma often find that the absolute worst parts of it are the attachment stuff. I mean, many orders of magnitude worse than the event components. Okay. So why would that be? Well, attachment wounds are about everything, right? They're about identity, they're about belonging, they're about safety, right? They're about everything that is important. And when we don't get our needs met, very, very often there's this huge existential loneliness that defines so much of our childhood. And then so much of our life is organized around controlling things so that we don't feel that way. So again, events have a beginning, a middle, and an end. An attachment wound has 10,000 tentacles. It's about everything. It's about lovability, belonging, everything, identity, right? So they're also particularly complicated because let's think about what happens in an attachment wound context. They're almost quadruply wounding. So attachment wounds are wounding in part because you have a need that you couldn't get filled. Okay, so that's one thing. And just having a need that you can't get met is a problem. Very, very often, if you're born to people that don't know how to meet your need, they will blame you and shame you and humiliate you for having those needs. Okay, so it's another round of trauma. Another thing that when we have needs that we can't get met, that often requires that we develop coping strategies to deal with that accumulating trauma, and those coping strategies have developmental costs very, very often. And the fourth way that attachment wounds are really, really, really complicated is that when you get your needs met when you're a kid, you have experiential learning. So
Hmm.
not only did you not get your needs met, not only were you blamed for having those needs, not only did you have to do all these coping strategies in order to accommodate for those unmet needs, you also didn't have the experience that showed you clearly who you are, what you're worth, how you deserve to be treated, that what you want matters, etc. So it's a very, very complicated somatic space. It's a very, very complicated informational space as well. So it's some of the hottest things that we're going to find in EMDR therapy. When clients dig into an attachment wound and they find a huge existential loneliness, it's like they're falling into, what we used to call in the 70s, quicksand. It's just like, they're just falling into this huge existential hole. So
Yeah.
that's in part why attachment wounds are so complicated, because we're not sure that the lies that we were told in childhood aren't correct. We just don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know that those lies aren't true.
Yeah. I want to maybe ask you one more question, then hear a little bit about your book, and then open it to Q&A. So in EMDR, at least in basic training, we're taught to tell the client to let whatever happens happen,
Yeah.
and hope that good things will happen. But sometimes you tell your client to let whatever happens happen, and good things don't necessarily happen. What
Yeah.
do you do then?
Yeah. Well, this is not unusual territory, right? Some kids need to bang around the living room, right? Some kids need to. That's how they learn where they are and where other things are. Some kids, you turn your back on them for half a second and they will burn down your whole house, right?
Yeah.
So we know. So what happens is that we train you how to work with a non-pervasively traumatized client. We train you to work with someone who's embodied. We train you to work with someone who knows how to turn the lens inward and notice, right? We train you to work with somebody who has adaptive information. right? I don't think there's very little in any training manual anywhere that tells you what to do when clients don't have any adaptive information at all. So we train you well to work with the clients that you see the least, right? The problem is that if you use that information and you forget everything you know about clients with complex trauma, because the people that I train, they know what complex trauma is very well. They've been working with it all of their lives, 8 hours a day for sometimes 20, 30 years, more time than they spent with their kids or with anything, right? They really know what complex trauma is, but yet we'll say, do EMDR this way with everybody, and then it doesn't work because we're trying to push our clients with complex trauma through a machine that wasn't built for them,
Yeah.
right? We're trying to push our clients with complex trauma through a machine built for a relatively healthy person. So
Right.
it's not controversial. It wouldn't be controversial in 1969 to say that our interventions need to match the nervous system that we're working with. So
Yep.
if that's the case, how can we do EMDR with a pervasively traumatized client in a way that feels like as closely as possible to what is remarkable and beautiful and effective in EMDR therapy, right?
Yeah.
So how do we match our interventions to the unique shape of the client's nervous system that we're working with?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And at this point, we can switch over. I see that we're starting to get questions in the chat. So before we go to that, Tom, can you talk a little bit about your book? So your publishing method is a little unique, not your
Yeah,
typical kind of publishing. So can you share a little bit about how people can access your book and what
good.
is more about what it is about and what EMDR therapists will get by reading the book?
Yeah. So the book is EMDR with complex trauma. It's the title of the book. 4 words, EMDR with complex trauma. It's not available for purchase yet. I need to do a few more tasks in order to get it on Amazon and get it into other places. It is self-published because I want to manage how it's distributed. So if you go to emdrwithcomplextrauma.com, you'll see that probably half of the book is on there now in PDF format that you can review. And all of the parts, so for those of you that came for the, working, the reprocessing phases with complex trauma, almost all of those chapters are online at that website. So you can start looking through that. So it's a different kind of book because I'm not looking to work with publishers. I'm not looking, and almost all of the reviews I received were from relatively new therapists. I wanted it to be reviewed by people who were recently trained rather than people who are kind of the biggest names in the EMDR universe. So the audience for this book is for relatively new therapists, and it will be accessible. So you'll be able to access it. You'll be able to buy the book. You'll be able to access it on the EMDR with Complex Trauma website, the whole book and individual chapters.
Here it is in the chat.
EMDRwithcomplextrauma.com. Yeah.
Yeah. And for those who watch it later, wherever you watch this video on YouTube or on the Art and Science of EMDR website, we're going to link to this book below the video. Thank you, Tom Zimmerman. Daniel from PsytechVR. Talk about PsytechVR. And there you are. It's the middle of the night. Thanks for being with us so late.
Sure. Thank you.
So can you tell us what is PsytechVR and a little bit about the EMDR features that you have?
Sure. At PsytechVR, we're creating exposure scenarios in the virtual reality. Everyone knows emotional exposure. Everyone knows that there is an in vivo therapy. but there is a virtual reality therapy which stands in the middle. Why? So VR therapy is safe. So it's safe as emotional exposure because your client is in front of you, sit and wear a headset, and in their headset, they can see different exposures. And we created the AI tool, the generative artificial intelligence tool, which can help you create any exposure using our system. So it may sound a little bit complicated. I have my system with you. I would love to show you how this works. So this is the interface of a therapist. The therapist takes a virtual reality headset, gives it a client, and next the therapist from the computer can choose a scenario. So we can start with relaxation practice. I can click relaxation, and I can go with, let's say, the relaxation, and I can choose Australia and pick a waterfall, click start. Yeah, we're going to skip the breathing exercise. And now our client in a virtual reality headset is in front of the waterfall. It's a great quality 360 video. You can turn left, you can turn right. It's a relaxative space with some sound. So just a thing where you can start. And we have about 50 relaxative spaces. But your client may come to you with a very specific request. So let's say your client is coming to you with a safe place of something unique, maybe something from their childhood dreams. So we can, let's say we're looking for forest, lake, flowers, sunrise. And now I can click create, and the system can help us create this unique safe place within 30 seconds. We can create a safe place, which is a lake and a forest, and there's a cozy cabin here, just within 30 seconds. So we can find something unique for our client. We can save this safe place. During the safe place, we can click the breathing icon and give a client a short box breathing exercise, or there is a variety of different other exercises here. So not only a box breathing, but also a line or a circle breathing, just a different way of visualization. So inside their safe place, we can give them a relaxation. And let's say we like this safe place. So we saved it. Once we save a safe place, now we can go and choose a scenario. We have a list of predefined scenarios like phobias, OCD, and such. Let's have a look. So I can choose one of scenarios. Let's say I'll go to specific phobias and choose the driving scenario. I click the highway scenario, I click start. With the stress assessment before we start the scenario. And next we appear on the road. So the client in the headset can see this road, so how hard it is to imagine it, and we can bring it in front of the eyes of the client just within seconds. So you can experience the exposure. And next, there is an option to go to the safe place. So I can always go to the safe place by clicking this button. I can bring the client back to the safe place. So this is our forest, which we created a few seconds ago. And we can go back. I can click back to exposure. We can jump back to exposure. And now a small piece, which we created with our advisor, Dr. Woody Oren. So if you click EMDR, there's a few options. For example, if I click in exposure, I can choose the time for the desensitization. We have different modes, how you can visualize this thing. There is a variety of ways. Oh, let me restart. There's a variety of ways how you can visualize it. Let's choose something standard. Like this. So you choose the time, and you can run it. So using this tool, you can also create exposures. So for example, your client is coming with something unique. So for example, you can say this. Say armed soldier, you can say tank, you can say desert ops, because we work a lot with Middle East, with Israel, we can say something like religion, Middle East. I click create. And now the system within 30 seconds can visualize this exposure, and it can really create any exposure for your client. So something that is hard to be imagined, you can create it using this tool. Okay. So we created soldier, Middle East village, a few tanks, and just visualized it within 30 seconds. If you need an explosion, if you need the fire, just whatever you type here, the system can help you create this exposure. And again, if I click EMDR, if I choose one of these options in the headset, I can run the desensitization. And the last thing which I would like to say is that the headset, every headset is coming with a pair of controllers. And we learned how to send a tactile feedback so these controllers can have the vibration. We have a vibration in our controllers. We have a sound coming from both parts of the headset, and we have this option. So we can have a bilateral stimulation, which can happen in front of exposure.
Thank you, Daniel. We're gonna, and you were kind enough to give one brand new headset of the MetaQuest 3S and 1 year membership to PsytechVR. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great weekend, Daniel. Thanks again. And we'll see you all next time.